On the morning of July 15th, 2016, I met with Vali Nasr, a former State Department advisor and Dean of Johns Hopkins SAIS, to talk about Turkey at the crossroads. Hours later, shocking news hit.
The breaking news from Turkey, where a military coup is underway. In a statement read out on Turkish television, the army have said that power in the country has been seized in its entirety.
President Erdogan survived the coup, and Dr. Nasser's thoughts on Erdogan's rise become even more important.
There's definitely a sense among the Turks themselves that they're at a crossroads. So Turkey veered off from its Kemalist legacy, where it embraced the idea of a Muslim democracy. It was a fast-growing, emerging market. It was democratizing. It was integrating into Europe. It was also integrating into the Middle East. Now it looks like many of those issues are open to question. So it's becoming somewhat more Islamic than originally was anticipated. It's becoming less democratic than it was advertised. Its relationship with the Arab world is broken for varieties of reasons, because of its support for Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, because of what's happened in Syria, in Iraq. It also has a fraught relationship now with Europe and the United States. And its economy is also not as promising as it was half a decade ago. So there's an open question as to what comes next for Turkey. So the idea that we had that Turkey is just going to democratize and grow into becoming a much more liberal, prosperous democracy is no longer easily discernible. So is it going to be a more authoritarian state? Is it going to become more Islamic? Is it going to fracture internally along ethnic lines between Turks and Kurds? So all of these things are on the table, and there's a great deal of debate and anxiety about it.
What do you think gave rise to this appeal of conservative populism in Turkey, a country that does have this secular history?
I think it was that popularity was always there. It was caged under a very structured Kemalist domination supported by the military, judiciary, the high civil service. Once Turkey started to open up to globalization, and it signed the Copenhagen Accords to see whether it can get into Europe, and that forced it to have a much more open system. And also the military had to step away from control of civilian institutions if Turkey aspired to be part of Europe. It gave room for a new political phenomenon to emerge in Turkey, which is small-town businessmen who are much more Islamic in their viewpoint, were not Kemalist, were able to now integrate into the European Union and take advantage of free trade, and also were able to essentially assert their presence in the political arena. They coalesced around a moderate Islamic party, which could survive the environment in Turkey, could appeal to them, could serve their interests, could be sufficiently friendly to be accepted by the outside world. And therefore, this AKP became a very powerful phenomenon. But on top of that, AKP had done very well in doing social works, not only in rural areas in Turkey, but in the slum areas of Ankara and Istanbul. And essentially, it created a social contract between the poor, the aspiring and rising middle class, and the political establishment of the party. And that social contract proved to be enormously powerful. And then there were particular episodes that helped them. For instance, the secular government, a number of secular governments came to power that proved to be incredibly corrupt, fractious, and ineffective, and therefore created tremendous amount of cynicism towards the secular parties. There was a massive earthquake in Turkey in 1999. And again, there was enormous amount of popular unhappiness with the ineffectiveness of the government taking care of it. In fact, most of the effective relief operations were carried out by Islamic NGOs, let's call them, who ultimately were the power base of the AKP party. So there was a shift, if you would, in Turkey towards AKP. And then the fact that AKP had very effective leadership in the form of Erdogan and Abdullah Gül and others, who had already shown their mettle in running effective city governments in Istanbul, Ankara, and other places, helped this transition. So let's put it this way: the Turks chose AKP not just because it was Islamic and people shared its values, but it was because it was pro-Europe, more pro-Europe than the Kemalists. That it was pro-democracy, because Islamism only gained footing in Turkey by riding on the shoulders of democracy, but also because it was effective government. And that's really the formula that propelled AKP to power.
And you talk a little bit there about how the platform was built and some of those initially successful programs. Has AKP and has President Erdogan changed over their time in power?
Well, that's the way it looks like it. I mean, in the first decade of its rule, AKP was everything that it promised. Turkey's economy grew even more rapidly. Its political system seemed to democratize. AKP very successfully built a wall between civilian rule and the military. In fact, it's the only, I think, successful case, I would say, particularly in the Muslim world, in the Middle East, where civilians have managed to reduce the power of the deep state and actually push it out of the political arena and in a way professionalize military's relationship with politics. And Turkey looked to be gaining international stature. It was becoming an important player in the Middle East. The Muslim world was looking at it as a model. The United States was looking at it as a stable ally. All of these things look to be correct. And Prime Minister Erdogan was seen as essentially a champion of Muslim democracy. He was seen, particularly in the Muslim world, as the Muslim Democrat par excellence, as the model that everybody can aspire to. And then, that has began to change very drastically, that he no longer has an image as a Democrat. Turkey has more journalists in prison than any other country in the world, that it clamps down on any form of dissent, that it uses judiciary in an arbitrary way to suppress dissent. And these no longer sort of position President Erdogan now and AKP party as a particularly democratic force. It looks like a movie we've seen in many other third world countries where democracy begins to sour into authoritarian rule, and there's always justification for it. We're doing this to control corruption. There's foreign conspiracy. There is, fractiousness. And then also, one of the elements that made AKP very appealing as a democratic party was that it was very inclusive towards the Kurds. And particularly Prime Minister Erdogan used the values of AKP, the sort of democracy, pro-Europe, pro-business, moderate Islam, to woo the Kurds into greater participation in Turkish society, much more than the Kemalists had ever allowed them. So they could have a television station, they potentially could even teach their own language in their own schools, they were even allowed to form a moderate party. President Erdogan, even as prime minister, began to kick around the idea of a peace deal with PKK, the terrorist organization. There was investments made in southeastern Turkey, which is the principal Kurdish region. As of late, that seems to have all been reversed, that he has been following policies that are much more trying to isolate the Kurds, and they, of course, are now reciprocating in kind by engaging in at least the fringe elements of the Kurds in not only challenging his authority, but some groups are even taking on to terrorism, which is alienating the Turks. And that suggests that AKP is no longer following a path of including the Kurds into a larger, more broader definition of Turkishness, Turkey citizenship, but rather, you're back to the old Turk versus Kurd politics within Turkey itself.
And do you think the idea is that in order to gain power, it was important for Erdogan to have these liaisons with Europe, it was important to improve relationships with Kurds? Has he now tamed the deep state, and is that why he is seemingly confident to go at it alone?
Well, it's a number of things. One is that Europe stopped being a promise for Turkey. First of all, Europe began to put hurdles on Turkey's continued progress towards Europe. In fact, there are many people who believe that the singular responsible party in Turkey's turn in the wrong direction is Europe, because the bait of Europe was what liberalizing Turkish law, improving civil-military relations, keeping the government on track with democracy, economic reform, etc. Once Europe began to say that Turkey will never be a member, that had an important impact internally. Then when Europe had developed economic problems after 2008, and you had Greece and Ireland and Spain and Portugal and these crises, many even businessmen no longer saw Europe necessarily as the future, and the Turks actually began to say, well, it's a good thing we're not part of the euro, because then we would have been afflicted as Greece is. We at least can devalue our currency and get out of deficits. So I think the change in relationship with Europe was very important. Secondly, events in Syria eventually touched off much more of a worry about Kurdish autonomy in Syria, and it's spilling over into Turkey. It actually put a sense of siege in Ankara about the dangers of letting the Kurds use the democratic process, etc. Or at least gave Erdogan a handle to say that we need to clamp down on the Kurds. Terrorism by ISIS and other groups has similar effect as well. And then, Erdogan, I think personally, and the political establishment in Turkey always worries that there's some kind of a conspiracy to undo the government. I mean, after all, Erdogan was on the death row by the military. And Erdogan even looked at the coup in Egypt and saw it as a model for what might happen in Turkey. And so this idea of trying to concentrate power preemptively in order to deny the military an inroad, runs deep very psychologically. And then, as the economy faltered, as there was a mass uprising after Arab Spring around an environmental park in Istanbul, the Gazi Tepe, and then there were charges of corruption and all of that. I think he interpreted all of these as essentially the beginnings of an Arab Spring in Turkey, which will only benefit the military. And so he kept doubling down on more authoritarian measures in order to preserve his rule, and trying to consolidate his constituency by telling them that Turkey was in danger because of the Kurds, terrorists, but also that everything that they had gained, the right to wear headscarf or to go to mosque, or to be able to have a more Islamic existence in Turkey, all of these things were in danger, and public demonstrations in the streets, etc. These were all conspiracies to overthrow him. And so again, it's something we've seen in many other countries. Russia makes the same claims, and other rulers in different parts of the world resort to the same things. So it's a set of things that put him off. But there's no doubt that with the military having been weakened during the height of the democracy in Turkey, he obviously has a lot more room to maneuver to do these things. But the irony is that the escalation of tensions with the Kurds is actually requires the military to be deployed again to fight, battles in eastern Turkey, and that is increasingly rehabilitating the military. And the more Turkey leans on a military solution to the Kurdish problem, and the more you have a national security environment because of bombings and attacks and killing of policemen, etc., whether it's done by PKK or whether it's done by ISIS, in every country, national security plays into the hands of the military. You end up with emergency, you end up with suspension of civil liberties, you end up with giving military a lot more room to maneuver. So in an ironic way, as of late, the military is gaining ground in Turkey on the back of these crises.
Are you doing okay on time?